Chapter 6, Reform of Church and State. It is one thing to try and influence the nature of change and to make things better by talking to individuals and to small groups. But what happens when you talk to individuals and you talk to small groups and things don't look like they're going to change? Do you turn to the state and you rally, you write referendums, you try and make changes in the government and enforce change? Do you hope for a revival, a reform of the church so that things might get better that way? These are big questions. We struggle with them today. We struggle with them a lot. What happens if the church you appeal to make change seems really weak and it's not going to rise up? Do you advocate for a general reform of the church? What's the relationship between God's heart for change, God's heart for the hurting, and our own relationships with church and with government? Woolman faced this really strongly in his own day. And again, I remind you, this was not the United States. This was a colonial government of Pennsylvania, founded by Penn, a Quaker. And this was in a time when the Quaker Church was changing. It was in a time when government in the United States, which wasn't the United States, with a colonial government from England, had its own conflicts. And Woolman is in the middle of it, wanting to see God's heart embodied in the way we lived our lives. So it's really striking for me to see just how we face these kinds of things. And you see this going on. I highlighted this aspect of John Woolman's thought in chapter 6 of the edition of John Woolman's journal. I think that the material in this chapter offers us a really marvelous opportunity to look at John Woolman in his own context and then ask ourselves, how do we navigate issues of state and church? Read the chapter and take careful attention of, I think there's a combination of Woolman's hopes, his concerns, his disillusionment, his turning to the state and yet then saying maybe not. All of these sorts of things. Watch how Woolman navigates this issue, both socially and in his own relationship with God. And then ask yourself, how do I do that? How can we do that today? What's a good way of us approaching these same kinds of issues? What kind of hopes do you place in government? What kind of hopes have you abandoned in terms of hopes in government? What's the appropriate response here and now? Likewise, Woolman gives a story about an old man who had been with the Quakers for a long time, and this old man speaks about his concerns about the state of affairs in the Quaker Church and the Society of Friends. He talks about the decline. The way we used to live was more devout, and now we're not as devout, and we've kind of gotten lax. And then Woolman himself reflects on this and reflects on the entire history of the church. And has the church declined or not? And I think, frankly, we act based a little bit sometimes on our assessment of the state of the church. And by looking at Woolman's own evaluation of the state of the church, we can turn it back in on ourselves and how do I think about decline or rise, revival or rejection? And what does that mean in terms of how I approach the church today? So reform of church, reform of state, these are big issues. And how do we assess the state of them. I think by using this chapter in John Woolman, we can make it a little window for us to evaluate the same kind of things today.